Entitled man attempts to claim my prepaid airline seat. I was flying to Las Vegas recently to meet up with some friends, and I had made sure to book my seat well in advance. This particular airline charges extra for certain seats, especially those with more space or desirable locations like the window. Due to a disability, I specifically chose and paid an additional $45 for a window seat with extra legroom. When I boarded the plane, I found a man already seated in my assigned spot, with another man in the aisle seat next to him. The middle seat was empty. I checked my boarding pass to confirm the seat number, then politely addressed the man sitting there. I informed him that he was in my seat and asked if he would please move. I'm a relatively small woman, while both men were quite large, appearing to be over 6 feet tall and easily over 200 pounds each. As soon as they spoke, it became clear they were accustomed to using their physical presence and loud voices to get their way. The man in the aisle seat immediately interjected, stating that the man by the window didn't need to move, and that I should just take the vacant middle seat. He insisted I shouldn't make a fuss about it. This really irritated me, especially since I had remained calm and polite. I responded that I wasn't making a scene, but simply asking for the seat I had specifically paid for. That's when the aisle man stood up, seemingly trying to intimidate me with his size. However, my professional background in frontline healthcare has exposed me to many individuals attempting to use size and aggression to bully others. This type of behavior simply doesn't work on me anymore. So I decided to try a different approach to resolve the situation. I turned my attention back to the man in my seat and offered him a proposition. I told him I would be willing to let him keep the seat if he paid me $50 cash. I explained that I had paid an extra $45 for it, and with tax or fees, $50 seemed a fair amount for him to essentially buy the seat from me. If he paid, the seat was his. He looked utterly shocked and blurted out, "You want me to pay you $50 for your seat?" I immediately seized on his reaction. "So you admit you knew this wasn't your assigned seat?" I stated clearly. "I'm gonna call the airline staff over and they can escort you to your correct seat. After all, I specifically booked this seat due to my disability, and you are attempting to take it without permission." At this point, several passengers around us had turned to watch the exchange, and their expressions towards the two men were far from sympathetic. The man in my seat visibly flushed, turning several shades of red in embarrassment. Without another word, he quickly moved into the middle seat. He pulled his hoodie over his head and remained there, sulking for the duration of the flight. His friend in the aisle seat also seemed to deflate and kept quiet. The takeaway from this experience is straightforward. Don't try to use your size or any perceived advantage to bully or intimidate others, especially when they are simply asserting their rights. It might just backfire spectacularly and make your own situation far more uncomfortable than it needed to be. Wow, trying to take a disabled person's paid seat and then getting hit with the "pay me $50 line? Subscribe if you think that comeback was gold. Caught an entitled mother cutting the line at Disney, got her and her kids removed. I recently took a trip to Disney World, my first time visiting since I was a child. It was a fantastic day, though the queues seemed significantly longer than I recall, perhaps just due to the excitement I felt back then. My friend and I discovered the single rider queues and decided to utilize them, as the wait times were considerably shorter and we didn't mind riding separately. While waiting in one of these lines, a family of 4, a mother, her 2 daughters, and the father, proceeded to walk directly through the middle of the queue, holding hands. Several people in line voiced their confusion and annoyance, asking what they were doing. The mother claimed they had forgotten something on the ride. They continued until they reached the point where the single rider line, fast pass queue, and the main standby line converge into a single waiting area. One woman behind me loudly questioned, "What exactly did you forget?" At this point, everyone in the single rider line realized her excuse was a lie and she was simply trying to bypass the wait and board the ride with her children. We were all understandably upset, having waited patiently. They managed to get shuffled into the pre-ride movie area ahead of my friend and me. We were honestly surprised that none of the staff members present seemed to notice or question their actions. Meanwhile, all of us in the single rider line were sharing our frustration and disbelief at this woman's audacity and sense of entitlement. When my friend and I finally moved into the pre-ride movie area, I decided to speak up. I approached a staff member and described the woman and her children, explaining how they had cut the entire line. He responded that since they were already in the queue to board the ride vehicle, there wasn't much he could do at that specific moment. We eventually made it to the actual boarding area for the ride vehicles, and sure enough, there was the mother and her 2 daughters positioned to board. I stopped another employee and detailed the situation to her. She said she would inform someone, but then walked away in the opposite direction from where the ride operators were stationed. Just then, one of the daughters ran up to a man standing directly behind my friend and me, tugging on his arm and calling out, "Come on, Dad!" When we turned around to see the father standing there. He seemed hesitant and refused to join his family at the front of the line, likely having overheard the general discontent among the waiting passengers regarding his family's behavior. This prompted everyone in the line to start voicing their complaints more loudly. Comments could be heard about what a poor example this was setting for the children, questioning why these people felt so entitled, why they thought they were special when everyone else had waited, some for hours, and why they would resort to lying to get their way. The entire line was speaking loudly enough for the family to clearly hear exactly what everyone thought of their actions. The father continued to hang back, letting other people move ahead of him, seemingly hanging his head in shame, while his family edged closer to the front of the line. At that point, I had completely lost my patience. I spoke to the people directly in front of me and explained that I wanted to go inform the ride operators about what had happened, as I was absolutely determined that this entitled group would not get on the ride. The passengers ahead of me were more than happy to step aside and let me through to speak with the operators. The mother was standing right in the walkway, as they were next in line to board. I tapped her on the arm and said, "Excuse me," giving her a direct, firm look. She immediately slid over without saying a word. I then addressed the ride operator, stating clearly, "This lady and her 2 children just cut the entire line by coming through the single rider's queue, claiming she forgot something. You can verify this with anyone in this line." The mother gave me the most shocked, disgusted, and utterly furious glare I've ever received. I walked back to rejoin my friend, and another woman from the line stepped forward to corroborate my account to the ride operator. The Disney mom then started attempting to claim that both of us were lying. That's when the rest of the people in line erupted, all speaking up simultaneously and confirming the story, determined not to let the entitled family get away with their behavior and board the ride. After a brief discussion among the staff, the mother and her 2 children were escorted out through a side exit. The entire line then broke into applause. Entitled mother calls my job to complain her adult son had to work late. A new colleague joined our team at the beginning of last month. Let's call him Sam. Sam is a quiet individual, appears to be in his early 30s, exceedingly polite, and constantly seems apprehensive, as if he's anticipating getting into trouble for something. Initially, I assumed he was just shy. However, within about a week, it became apparent that something wasn't quite right. He would receive phone calls every 30 minutes like clockwork. Eventually, I felt compelled to ask if everything was alright. That's when he confessed it was his mother. She apparently needed to know his whereabouts and activities at all times. This wasn't just a quick check-in. It was detailed updates like, where are you sitting, what are you eating, and who are you speaking with. He explained that this is how he was raised and he had never managed to break free from the habit. I could visibly see him withdraw into himself with each call, as if his energy was being drained in real time. Anyway, it was the end of the month, which meant we had department reporting to finalize, requiring everyone to stay a few extra hours to complete the work. The office was quiet, everyone was focused on their tasks, and suddenly Sam's phone rang again. He stepped out of the office to take the call. Approximately 2 minutes later, he returned looking completely drained and pale. He approached me and said, with a look of genuine distress, "Hey, my name Mr. Coco. My mom wants to speak with you." I honestly thought he was making a joke, but he wasn't. He looked genuinely upset, almost on the verge of tears. Out of sheer disbelief and a bit of morbid curiosity, I took the phone. And oh, was that a mistake? This woman immediately launched into a tirade against me. "How dare you keep my son working past regular office hours?" she demanded. "He needs to come home and rest." She went on, "You have no idea what he's been through," and even brought up concerns about how dangerous the roads are. I was so taken aback by the sheer audacity of it all that I could barely formulate a proper response. I simply managed to say, "Ma'am, I believe Sam can explain the situation better than I can," and handed the phone back to him. And that's when something quite remarkable occurred. Sam finally seemed to reach his breaking point. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone was firm and steady. "I need this job, Mom," he said. "You can't keep doing this. I'm staying late because it's part of my job responsibilities and everyone else is here working late too. Please, just stop." There was a moment of silence on the other end, and then he simply ended the call. Honestly, Witnessing that moment, I felt a sense of pride for him. I understand how incredibly difficult it can be to stand up to controlling parents, especially when that control has been a constant throughout your entire life. We finished up our work about an hour later. I offered to take him out for a quick drink to help him decompress after that ordeal. He looked like someone who had just had a significant long-held burden lifted from their shoulders. However, when I dropped him off near his place, he gave me a small, somewhat awkward smile and simply said, "Thanks, tonight's probably going to be rough." Since that evening, I haven't heard his mother's voice directly, but he still receives those calls. They just seem to be less frequent now. I sincerely hope he finds his way to true independence and happiness. Some limitations aren't physical, they are carried within one's mind, like a cage without bars. Imagine being the coworker and getting that phone call from his entitled mom, complaining about him working late. Unbelievable. After years of condescending behavior, I finally told my father's friend I hate him. Years ago, my father became friends with a man I'll call Harold through mutual acquaintances. They seemed to get along well. I was 18 and attending college when I first met Harold, and we never developed any kind of close relationship. Despite this, he always seemed to perceive himself as a close family friend, and his attitude towards me was consistently infantilizing and condescending. Every time I anticipated seeing him, I would try to convince myself that it wouldn't be so bad, only for him to prove me wrong within moments of interacting. Harold routinely disregarded my personal boundaries and would make comments like, "You're not 19, you're a baby," often interjecting this while I was speaking with other people. He would seize any opportunity to patronize me, whether it was about my education, my hobbies, or simply my general choices. He clearly noticed that his behavior annoyed me and would often playfully ask if I hated him. Up until recently, I always responded no, primarily to avoid causing friction or discomfort for my father. The situation reached a breaking point during a barbecue when Harold interrupted the gathering to loudly proclaim, "I really like you even though you're an impolite brat." I was 20 years old at the time. I had been quiet for most of the day, actually working on a college paper during the event, but I had responded patiently and politely whenever anyone spoke to me. Regardless of my behavior, I knew he had no right to address me in such a disrespectful and demeaning manner. Following that incident, I began actively trying to avoid any social events I knew Harold would be attending. Yesterday it was my father's girlfriend's birthday, and they hosted a small lunch party at my dad's apartment. My fiancé, our 6-month-old son, and I attended. Unfortunately, Harold was also present. It had been months since I last saw him, but he immediately reverted to treating me as if I were a naive child. It seemed irrelevant to him that I'm engaged, a mother, and now 26 years old. I spent the majority of the party attempting to ignore his unwelcome and unsolicited advice about me being supposedly too young to be married or to be a mother. It helped that most of the other guests appeared to disagree with his views and were generally supportive. My baby slept for most of the afternoon in a bassinet set up in my old room. When he woke up needing to eat, I excused myself from the party for a while to breastfeed him. When I returned to the main gathering area, I was met with jokes and comments, all originating from Harold. He suggested I was probably struggling as a mother if my son needed me away for so long. He then proceeded to interrupt a conversation I was having with another of my father's friends to question almost every aspect of my parenting decisions. This was particularly galling given that he doesn't even have custody of his own daughter. He also continued to make remarks about my age in relation to my life choices. At that point, I decided I couldn't tolerate it any longer, especially after he questioned if I had considered giving my baby up for adoption when I was pregnant. I gathered my son and informed my fiancé that we were leaving immediately. We made a point of saying goodbye to everyone present, deliberately excluding Harold from our farewells. As we reached the door to leave, Harold approached us, asking why we were departing so soon. I tried to offer a polite excuse, but he persisted in trying to convince us to stay. After a brief, awkward back-and-forth exchange, he reverted to his usual tactic and jokingly asked if I hated him. This time I looked him directly and responded clearly, "Yes, I do. Can we go now?" He was momentarily speechless and didn't say anything further. My fiancé and I then left the apartment. On our way home, my fiancé expressed how proud he was of me for finally standing up for myself. My father called this morning expressing the opposite sentiment, and we had a brief argument about the incident. Although we ultimately agreed to drop the subject for the moment, I'm under no illusion that this is the end of the matter, but if there are further repercussions, they won't be initiated by me. While this might not be the most conventionally admirable moment of my life, and a small part of me feels a twinge of regret for the directness, I am absolutely finished with allowing that man to treat me with such disrespect and entitlement. This entitled guy finally got told off after years of treating Op like a baby. Sometimes you just have to say it. What's the most entitled thing someone has ever said to you? Let me know below. My parents and brother returned seeking financial help and were met with reality. As some who commented on my previous post might have predicted, my parents eventually re-established contact, and their motivation was exactly what was anticipated. They wanted either my money or my signature on a financial document. I had mentally prepared for the typical narcissistic arguments about how I supposedly owed them, or perhaps some misplaced rhetoric about sharing wealth. While those exact phrases weren't used, the situation that unfolded was somewhat aligned with that expectation, though perhaps a bit more restrained. It seems they've learned not to push me quite as far as they used to, and their approach this time seemed more focused on eliciting pity. It began when my parents reached out to me recently via social media, requesting a meeting in a public place of my choosing. This immediately felt like a calculated move, but I wasn't intimidated. In fact, I found it somewhat amusing. They know I'm not someone they can manipulate or take advantage of anymore, so I was genuinely curious to see what they were after this time. I selected a well-known casual restaurant chain and agreed to meet them there. My brother Dan was also present, though he remained mostly silent initially. We exchanged awkward greetings, ordered some drinks, and then they quickly got to the point. My parents began pleading with me to help Dan secure his own apartment so he could finally move out of their place. Apparently Dan's credit history is quite poor. I couldn't help but wonder why that might be the case. Perhaps his wife's spending habits are a contributing factor. Their request was that I assist either by providing a significant amount of money up front or by co-signing for the apartment lease and committing to help pay the monthly rent. My response to both options was a simple and firm no. That's when Dan became visibly angry and raised his voice, shouting that I have so much while he has a family to support, implying I don't have such responsibilities. He insisted he needed my help and that I should be willing to spare money for his family since I don't have one myself. I couldn't help but laugh at the sheer nerve of his statement. I calmly asked them where they were when Ike needed help. Oh, that's right, I reminded them. They were pointing and laughing while I was homeless. Or perhaps we should delve even further back, I suggested, to my childhood experiences, which I would be happy to discuss with plenty of people listening around us. My mother immediately grabbed my hand, pleading with me not to bring up any of that history. Both my father and Dan simply looked away, saying nothing. I'm quite sure they wanted to respond with their usual dismissive or aggressive tactics, but for some reason they held back their tongues. I then asked them if they genuinely believed I was wealthy or something along those lines. The expressions on their faces clearly indicated that they did. When I proceeded to explain that I don't actually have that kind of money readily available, they looked at me with complete shock like deer caught in headlights. I broke down the financial reality for them, explaining the substantial amount I had managed to save for the down payment on my house, and the extreme measures I had to take in terms of living and working to save that much so quickly. I emphasized that I had spent nearly all of those savings on the down payment and was still in a phase of financial recovery. I acknowledged that I do have monthly income to spare, but the majority of it is currently being channeled directly into savings. I then pointed out to Dan that his yearly salary, which he had mentioned, was actually slightly higher than mine. I then provided a rough, simplified breakdown for my parents, explaining that approximately 70% of my income goes towards essential expenses like my mortgage, insurance, gasoline, internet, phone bill, food, and other necessary bills. This leaves at most about 30% that I can potentially put into savings. I stressed the importance of saving that money to get back on solid financial ground and crucially to build up an emergency fund. I explained that my truck is an older model from the 90s, and if it were to break down, I would need funds immediately for repairs or a replacement. I listed other potential unexpected expenses that require a rainy day fund, such as home repairs, medical bills, taxes, legal fees, or any sudden need for quick cash. Therefore, I concluded I simply cannot afford to spare money for Dan's apartment. Furthermore, I reiterated my absolute refusal to co-sign for anything, as that would make me legally responsible for any payments Dan failed to make. I pointed out that this is likely the very reason my parents hadn't co-signed for Dan's apartment themselves a long time ago. At this, my mother began to cry again. Throughout this exchange, I felt I was consistently one step ahead of their attempts to manipulate the situation. I made it clear directly to their faces that I am not an ATM and I am not a fool to be taken advantage of. I fully expected my father to become angry as he has done my entire life whenever I've refused to enable my brother, but this time he simply didn't. There was no explosion, not even a sneer on his face. The only way I can describe his expression was a mix of regret and defeat. Perhaps regret for his past behavior as a parent, or perhaps regret because he realized he no longer holds the power to bully me into submission. It's hard to say for certain. Regardless, my parents had no real counter-arguments, and I was unwavering in my refusal to provide any financial assistance. Dan, clearly frustrated, stood up and declared that the meeting was a waste of their time and that he was leaving. My mother started to apologize for his behavior, but Dan was insistent on departing. In an effort to perhaps diffuse the tension or simply be polite despite everything, I offered to buy them a round of unlimited soup and salad since we hadn't ordered any food yet, only drinks. I suppose they couldn't pass up free food, and they stayed. I made a conscious effort to steer the conversation towards anything other than money or the recent unpleasantness. Dan remained mostly silent throughout the meal, either eating or preoccupied with his phone. My parents engaged in awkward conversation with me. They mentioned that they had recently started attending a local Christian church and had been going for the past 2 weeks. I offered a simple good for them, which they, of course, took as an opening to try and recruit me to join them. I politely declined, and thankfully, they were sensible enough not to press the issue further. When the meal concluded, Dan left a $10 tip on the table and walked out without saying another word to me or his parents. My mother again made excuses for his abrupt departure, and we all parted ways shortly after. That was essentially the end of the meeting. It wasn't nearly as dramatic as I had anticipated, but the outcome was significantly better than how interactions with my parents and brother used to unfold. As for Dan's wife, she has apparently been regularly complaining about my parents online. It seems she's not happy about not being the primary focus or queen bee within their household, and I suspect her difficult behavior is finally starting to wear on my parents. Why else would they be so desperate to reach out to me after everything? Apparently, Esil has even suggested that my parents move into a camper, similar to what I had to do, to create more space in the house, and they have repeatedly refused this idea. She seems to have cultivated a following of like-minded, entitled individuals online, because occasionally I receive messages from strangers who are intent on expressing their anger at me for not sacrificing my home for SIL's benefit. I no longer engage with these people. I simply block and move on. There was one particularly persistent individual who somehow obtained my phone number and would call from a different number each time. Yes, it seemed to be the same person who had previously called me to say I needed to make way for a real family man like Dan. However, I honestly couldn't care less about their opinion. The calls do seem to have decreased, possibly stopped altogether, ever since I made it clear to that person that their continued harassment was only serving to amuse me. The last call was sometime around the beginning of the month, and there's been silence from them since then. Abandon op when they're homeless, then ask for money. This entitled family is next level. If you like this one, hit subscribe and let me know your favorite entitled story below.